Hello and welcome to Rick's Woodworking. Today we're going to do a side table for the end of a couch in our home office. It's going to be 3 feet wide by 2 feet high, and I'm going to base the design on another table for the back of a couch in another spot at home. This is going to be built with two 2x6 pieces of construction lumber, and we need to trim them to width and to get rid of the round over that you typically get with this construction lumber. An in-feet table and a featherboard make this real easy. With those pieces cut, it's time to go head over to the miter saw. I'm going to cut 2 miters on the top and 1 miter at the top of the leg and square or flat at the bottom. I usually do these on the flat at the miter saw because I get much better results. These are going to get dadoed into the legs. Those dados are 3/4 of an inch, so I have to add 1.5 inches to those shelves beyond the narrowest point of the top. So I just use my square to transfer the lines and add 1.5 inches and cut those square. Back to the table saw to cut the dados. I used a scrap piece, which is the thickness of the board, to set the first cut, and then a spacer to set the second cut and adjust for the thickness or the width of the blade. And it also separates the board from the fence so I don't get any binding at all. For the second dado, I found the center of the board and accommodated the 1.5 inch thickness of the shelf itself. This time around, I'm going to use an extension to my miter gauge with a stop block and that same offcut of wood to set that first cut. Once I've done that one, I'll come back and use that spacer for the thickness of the blade to do the second cut. I could have used the stacked dado head cutter for all these, but given the number of cuts, I decided to just leave the setup in the saw and nibble away at the pieces. Now with my chisel, I'll just clean up the bottom of the dados and get everything smooth and flat and ready for glue up. Now let's check the fit on that middle shelf. And it's pretty tight, but that's going to be all right. And here's what the entire piece looks like. Looking pretty good. A couple of gaps here and there that we'll clean up later. Here I'm laying out for 2 biscuit slots. I set up for 2 biscuits on each of the miters to reinforce the joint. I fiddle a lot with the biscuit joiner because I want to make sure that it's true and flat at a 45 degree, or else the joint will never come together. With those cut, it's time for some glue up. Plenty of glue on these biscuits. They are, after all, what holds the joint together, since it's all end grain. And again, lots of glue. Want to make sure this all holds nice and tight. Now when I insert the biscuits, I'll inevitably get some glue squeezing out, and I'll just redistribute it with my fingers. Even though the joint looks really good, we're still going to have to clamp it. I set up some blocks to make sure that I don't mar the wood with the clamps. I'll end up using 2 clamps per leg and 1 clamp across the entire top to cinch it all together. Here I'm checking for square. Turns out that there's a slight bow on the top, so the square never really lined up. So I distributed any error across both joints to make sure the piece looked symmetrical. Now let's work on that center shelf. Lots of glue on this dado as well, even though you'll see later that it's pretty tight. Some persuasion, first by hand and then with my dead blow. My goal here is to make sure that the pieces are even and flush. That will reduce the sanding later. A few more clamps and we'll let the glue dry overnight. With the glue dry, it's time for sanding. We start at 80 grit, and I'm doing the edges first to make sure that everything is flush and smooth. I'm also going to do all the surfaces, including the bottom of the boards. I went through all the grits down to 150 to make sure we had a nice smooth finish. Once we're done at 150, I came back with 220 and just ease the edges off of all the boards. Because when we go to paint, paint doesn't like to stick to sharp edges. I started with a brush and cut in all the corners and then did all the fill with a foam roller to get a nice smooth finish. I ended up doing 2 coats, but this is all water-based paint, and since this is all soft pine, the grain gets raised, which means that between coats we have to do some sanding. After that first coat dried, I took some 220 grit sandpaper and a sanding block and made sure all the surfaces were smooth. After our second coat of paint, I started with some polyurethane, but this time with a brush, because a foam roller would have left bubbles on the finish. 3 coats of polyurethane will keep this piece looking nice for a long time. And here it is at the side of the couch, already holding stuff. Hope you enjoyed this video, and join us next time to see what else we'll build on Rick's Woodworking.